Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is a blueberry bush. This is the first video in a series of videos I'm going to do on growing blueberries. This first video will just be the very basics of blueberry bushes or blueberry plants. In part two, I'm going to go over how to select the right blueberry plant for the area in which you live in the country. In part three, I'm going to show you how to container plant them, because there's a good part of the country where you can only really grow them in containers, but you can actually grow them very effectively in containers. And then in part four, I'm going to show you how to plant them in poorly draining soils. And then in part five, I'm going to show you how to propagate them. So let's get started. This is a blueberry bush. Specifically, this variety is called Rekka. It's a northern high bush variety that's just flowering now in the late winter or early spring. Depending on the variety of blueberry you use in your area, they can grow anywhere from 3 feet in height all the way to 10 feet in height. But through pruning, typically we want to keep them somewhere in the 5 to 6 foot range where we can still pick them very easily. One of the most amazing things about blueberries is through plant breeding, we now have varieties that will grow all the way up to zone 3, which is the absolute coldest areas of the continental United States, and then all the way down into zone 9. It's really amazing. People couldn't grow blueberries in the far southern parts of the country until recently, and there's these new varieties over the last 30 years called southern high bush. I'll go over them in detail in the second video. And now it's allowing people in very warm areas of the country that get very small amounts of cold weather in the winter to grow blueberries. Depending on the variety of blueberry that you use in your area will depend on how fast they grow. Some varieties only reach about 3 feet in height, so they just don't grow very quickly. The varieties that I can grow in my area can actually grow a foot in a single season. In terms of sun or shade, fruit plants pretty much across the board would prefer full sun. You have to get at least 3/4 of a day of sun on these. One thing about blueberries is the roots are very close to the surface generally, so they do have to be well mulched. If you're growing them out in a full sun location and the sun is absolutely baking the roots around them, that can be an issue. And I'll show you that in a planting video, that we definitely do want to have them mulched in such a way that the roots don't cook off of them. Typically on a blueberry farm, the plants are actually close enough together that they're shading one another's roots. You'll frequently hear me talk about plants being acid-loving plants. Blueberries are very much acid-loving plants. They like the soil between 4.5 and 5.5, which is very low. The reason for that is that they require a lot of iron, and iron is more easily taken up by plants when the pH of the soil is very low. As the pH becomes too high, the iron becomes chemically bound in the soil, and the plant has a difficult time taking it up. It's why you see plants struggle when the pH is above 7. You'll see yellow leaves on plants frequently. It's usually an iron deficiency. They have a hard time getting the iron out of the soil. So the fact that these need a pH that low limits some of the areas of the country that we can grow them in the ground. Most of the eastern United States and the upper Midwest and the Pacific Northwest have pHs that are low enough, or at least close enough, that they can be lowered pretty easily to grow blueberries. A lot of the country, the limestone is very close to the surface, and it's very, very difficult really to get the pH low enough. I'll show you in video 4, we'll plant them above the ground. I don't know that that's the best way to do it really. If your pH is that high, you may want to just consider container growing them. And in video 3, I'll show you what to use in your container to be successful growing them as a container plant. Of course, the main feature of blueberry plants is if everything goes well, you end up with a tasty fruit at the end of it. You'll notice this plant is just waking up from dormancy, and the very first thing these do is flower. And they have these bell-shaped white flowers. The bees will typically pollinate these this time of year. Here in my area is usually late March up until mid-April or so. It's best to have more than one variety of blueberry. The bees will cross-pollinate them. Even the self-pollinating blueberries are best when you have multiple varieties. You end up with a superior berry, and the bees doing that work for you. The flowers will mature into the berries, and as you can notice down here below, this one's starting to leaf out. The foliage is actually a nice blue-green color. Blueberries are reasonably drought tolerant. The first year I would definitely keep a close eye on them and water them well when they dry out. Once they're established, they don't need a lot of ongoing watering if you're in an area that gets normal rainfall. Obviously, if you're growing them in an area that doesn't get normal rainfall, you need to put them on some sort of irrigation system. If you're growing them in containers, you're going to have to check them frequently, obviously. The ones in the ground, though, the time I would definitely be paying attention as the fruit is maturing in the early summer. If you go through any kind of drought stress during that period of time, you can end up with either one of two things: inferior fruit, where they just don't have enough water to really form a large fruit, or you'll get some fruit drop. The plant will just decide to shed a certain amount of the fruit in order to kind of save itself for the next season. So do keep a close eye on them in late May and early June as the fruit is maturing. Blueberries are best fertilized before they leaf out in the early spring, so late winter or early spring. Any sort of slow release fertilizer for fruiting plants would be ideal. That's not going to have a whole lot of nitrogen in it. My pH is low enough in my area that I don't have to continue to drive the pH down using the fertilizer. If you're in an area where the pH is too high, you can actually get a fertilizer for acid-loving plants, and that will help drive the pH down. Frequently, they'll have sulfur-coated urea as the nitrogen source, and that's good for bringing down the pH. Blueberry pruning requires an entirely separate video. There's a lot to know, actually, on blueberry pruning. The first few years you have it in the ground, you're not going to have to worry about it a whole lot, but something you can notice on this plant, these pieces right here were last year's growth. There really aren't going to be a lot of flowers on these. These will have the flowers and fruit over the next few years. These canes here that are 2 years old are producing the flowers this year and will have the berries on them. And they'll produce fantastic berries for 2 or 3 years, and then those canes will kind of age out, and we'll actually take those out in the future right down at the base. We'll take about 1/3 of the oldest wood out of these after they've been in the ground for a few years, and we'll thin them pretty drastically, because the best fruit is going to be on canes that come up from the ground that are between 3 and 6 years in age. We don't really get a lot of chewing insects on blueberry plants. That doesn't tend to be a problem. Obviously, birds are an incredible pest on blueberries, and they'll have to be netted or some sort of noise-making machine put out to avoid losing some of your blueberries to birds pretty much every year. They are extremely susceptible to root rot, specifically Phytophthora root rot, and you really shouldn't plant these flush to the ground. I'll show you in the planting part of this series that we're going to raise them up. If you go to a U-pick blueberry farm, you'll notice they're all in raised rows. So that's the very basics of blueberries. Next week, I'll talk about the different types of blueberries that grow in different areas of the country and tell you how to go about picking the best blueberry varieties for your area. Thank you for watching my video, and if it was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also, comment below with any questions you have about blueberries. Thanks again.